First, though, let's begin with the European and US economies diverging as global businesses react to Donald Trump's trade policies. US GDP shrank 3% at an annual rate during the first quarter. That's its first contraction since 2022. And it's mainly due to a surge in US imports as companies tried to restock before the tariffs took effect. Markets opened lower, and they've since clawed back much of their losses, President Trump blaming the slowdown on his predecessor.
Core GDP, and this is, you probably saw some numbers today, and I have to start off by saying that's Biden. That's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy.
Meanwhile, the EU economy grew 0.3%, barely growing at all, a third of 1%. And a good part of that growth comes from Ireland and from foreign companies that are based there for tax reasons. You're getting the sort of picture and the way it comes. The EU is still facing tariffs and declining consumer sentiment, and things aren't looking too good. Martin Wolf is the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. Martin is with me now. I suppose the first core question, Martin, is how justified is President Trump in claiming that the negative GDP in Q1 is, quote, Biden's market?
Well, as far as I can see, and we've only got very tentative numbers, is the 0.3% annualized fall cannot be due to Biden, because it's essentially about import growth. The huge rise in imports actually shrinks GDP, and the reason for a huge rise in imports, pretty obviously, is people are accelerating imports ahead of the tariffs, and that's a Trump policy. So while it is true that part of the first quarter was under Biden, it's very difficult to explain this decrease, modest decrease in an annualized rate, as anything but due to the Trump tariffs.
If you now extrapolate forward, because the first quarter didn't see the effects of the headwinds in place, would you expect Q2 and Q3, as we see, regardless of what agreements might or deals might be done, they're going to be badly affected by the existing tariffs, everything from 145, 25, 20, pays your money, it takes your choice?
I would assume, but this is now getting really difficult to predict because there are so many uncertainties, that it will cause shrinkage, particularly over this time period in retail trade, because retail trade is going to get so much more expensive when these tariffs go into effect. So the real level of retail trade will shrink, and that will show up in GDP, in real consumption. Of course, the longer term effects, which you might expect if people expect tariffs to last, which is a big question, on investment might be positive, but that won't kick in for a year or two. So I think it's very plausible, nothing is certain, that over the next 3 quarters, we're going to see a shrinkage in GDP because of the impact of this on people buying.
We are here tonight in the Czech Republic, of course, not a Euro country, part of the Union, but not a Euro country, a highly export-driven economy through Germany, which of course is, or Austria, which is going to be affected more closely by the tariffs. Are countries like the Czech Republic in some trouble in these circumstances?
I don't know precisely how linked up they are, but there's no question that European exports of automobiles, which are a target sector, will be affected by the Trump tariffs. Of course, we don't know what tariffs will be in effect a month or two from now. Anything could happen. They might have changed. I mean, I don't think the current tariff regime will last, but who knows? But yes, there's going to be As things stand at the moment, a negative effect on European exports in this particular
Right.
sector and of course in other sectors, and it's bound to affect the suppliers of inputs into German production and German exports. So yes, the Czech Republic and other European countries are vulnerable.
Reading your recent articles on the battle between the US and China, particularly the one most recently, you are suggesting that essentially the US, although China suffers, the US arguably comes off worse, and it is Donald Trump that blinks, as he already has to some extent, but has to blink even further.
Well, my suggestion is that the US will not be able to force or persuade countries around the world in return for low tariffs on their exports to impose very high tariffs on China. I think they will regard that as too risky. The US is too unreliable, and therefore they will refuse such deals. If that is the case, then the US has the key question: what does it do with its now delayed
Right.
reciprocal tariffs? And nobody knows. But in its straight, just leave that aside because we don't know, the straight battle between the US and China, I think China can bear more pain, assuming the US does not get the rest of the world to team with it against China, can bear more pain. It can offset the demand shock from the tariffs by expanding domestic demand, while the US is going to have a very significant supply shock from an absence of cheap Chinese inputs. So my guess is the politics of this are, in the medium term, in favor of China.
Right. Martin, I'm grateful. Thank you, sir, for staying with us tonight. Martin Wolf in London tonight.